Hello. What is this video? This video is me growing. Not like swelling, not vor, but trying to improve and learn. Human stuff. I like telling you guys to try out new things, take educated risks, and, put yourself out there. It's difficult to do though. It seems like when people hand out advice about trying new things, they come in two varieties. Either they're hermits that fantasize that every problem that could go wrong will go wrong, so they just never do anything. Or they brush off every concern as being so simple, because they just want you to do something. Misguided enthusiasm, in other words. As a result, they're totally worthless. I like to imagine that I'm in the middle, because I'm so special. I'm a pretty princess. So this video is me trying something terrifying. For me. It's me being scared out of my mind, but doing it anyway. In this case, it's me flying overseas from Kentucky to the United Kingdom, and then spending a week there. I've never been on vacation. I've never flown. I've never used my passport. And I did all of this on my own. I was meeting people in the UK, but I traveled alone. Some of you couldn't imagine doing that. Some of you may think it's trivial. Point being, for me, it was totally alien, very risky, and very frightening. So this is sort of a vacation slideshow, but the point of the video is to showcase doing something that's scary to you, and that it's reasonable to be scared of it, and it's reasonable to think you can overcome it. The plan was to get to Cardiff, Wales, eventually. There's a whole chapter planning where to go. I'm not going to get into it. I also already had my passport because in eons past I thought I'd visit Canada, before the Troubles. But as I recall, getting a passport isn't too big of an issue. Just get a Walmart picture, prove you're a real human, etc. I also decided early to monetize my trip so I could use it as a write-off. Not because, I'm being sleazy, but because it was a good idea and because it was so expensive otherwise. I had to spend a lot of time talking to an accountant to make sure I was handling it correctly. Even if I couldn't make it a write-off, I still really wanted to make a video like this. Point being, I also had to worry about keeping a log of everything I was doing and buying. I also had to get some stuff like power adapters and a stabilized camera and some way of mounting it to my body that wouldn't make me look like a pervert or a criminal. If you were taking a trip like this, I doubt you'd have to worry about any of this stuff. Something I expected but still underestimated is how much planning there actually is, and how complicated it is. For example, I'd never flown, so I didn't want a bunch of non-direct flights. I'd just get lost. But airlines don't offer direct flights during certain times of the year, or they're super limited. I also wanted to time my flight to land around the same time as my girlfriend, so we'd be in the same country around the same time. Airline websites also tend to be a mess, and will do stuff like switch your destination airport without telling you that they did it. I also had to decide on whether to try to go to Louisville, Chicago, or Nashville to fly, since there are 0 major cities or airports near me. I could take a train to Chicago, but the sites were unclear on where the stations ended up and how far they are from the airport. There are shuttles that go back and forth between stations and airport stations, but that was another layer problem I didn't want to deal with. I also didn't want to make all these plans and not even make it to the plane. I eventually convinced my mother to drive my car to Nashville and back, but she later backed out because she was afraid of being alone in traffic. She's in her late 70s, and having driven to Nashville traffic, I don't blame her. So I also had to research how to pay for parking. As it turns out, all the good options went out of business years ago, or went up in price. There was one left, but they'd gotten in trouble several times for using customers' vehicles to run errands without telling them. So I ended up just parking at the airport economy lots themselves, which was another problem because I didn't know how they worked or how to pay for them. In fact, I'd had no clue how to pay for them until I got back to the United States after the trip, because no one will tell you how it works. After buying my airline tickets, I also had to research what kind of bags I could bring without paying more, which was a little confusing because the site just said you were allowed bags, checked bags, and carry-ons, but wouldn't mention what the devil those were. I had to go find a separate page that actually defined the measurements of everything and stipulated that one bag is free and a carry-on is free as long as they're a certain size and weight limit. but checked bags weren't, although they check all the bags. Whatever. So I had to go shopping for bags that were under those dimensions and then later weigh everything I'd packed. If I didn't, I'd either have to walk back to my car to leave behind an entire bag, repack, or just, I don't know. Airports don't like mystery bags lying around. Also, once I touched down, I would have to figure out how to get to a bus terminal. In my whole life in the US, I'd never used a bus. America is huge and spread out, so it's why everyone has to drive here. If you want to go to the store, it's often a 10 to 20 kilometer trip, not a 20-minute walk. So I had to learn how the bus system worked, prepay for tickets, and also ensure we had a taxi waiting for us to get to a hotel. I won't go into all the hotel research, which was another few weeks of planning, but the short of it is that we eventually found a fairly cheap one that had some irreverent, catty replies from the owners directed at a few idiots that were complaining about nothing. Both of us really appreciated their attitude towards bad customers, so that's where we stayed. We also met the guy later on, and we had a fun conversation about one review in particular about a lady and her, I think, 2-year-old that she was claiming was going to quote-unquote Spider-Man her way out of one of the windows onto the roof. Whatever. But that was fun. Okay, but this was all really stressful. I've had a lot of anxiety ever since about 2021, or 1982. And this was really building a lot of it for a lot of reasons. There's a lot of moving parts, and I had never done any of this. No planes, no buses, no taxis. And no one was traveling with me for 95% of the trip. And no one in my family knew anything about travel, except for one of my brothers, and it turned out he'd let his wife at the time do most of the planning, so when he assured me it was very simple, it was because he'd never done it himself. But I figured it out. I did it. It worked out. My advice for this is to just give yourself a lot of time between travel points, at least an hour, because you'll get somewhere and have no clue where you are or where to go. Normal flights, 2 hours. International, at least 3. It sucks. Which leads me to another problem, my sleep schedule. I've always had sleep problems, even as a kid. My college life was cramming all my classes into a huge ball so I could commute at the end of the semester at the start of the day. By the middle of the semester, I was getting to classes at the end of my day because I kept rotating forward. There would always be a week or two where I was trying to get my classes in what was figuratively 3 a.m. for most people. It's nightmarish. So for a month, I was desperately trying to either hold my sleep in perfect alignment with the UK or time my sleep to rotate at the right moment. This was very difficult for me since I needed to wake up at around 2 a.m. and go to bed around 5 p.m. Needless to say, this didn't work out too well, and I ended up waking up around 10 a.m. instead. Not too big a deal until you realize that driving to Nashville takes about 3 hours. Waiting at the airport is another 2 or 3 hours. An international flight from Nashville to London takes over 9 hours. And the bus from London to Cardiff is another 3 hours. Also, I had to wait for my girlfriend to touch down and travel from her airport to mine, which meant another 6 hours of waiting. I also had some chores to take care of before I left, including visiting my grandmother, who had just broken her leg the week prior. Lots of things to worry about. But anyway, I left. I made my mother cry because she was terrified. I cried because I was terrified. But I was more scared of not trying. And I guess that's what a lot of this comes down to. Forming connections should be effortless. It should just work. Unfortunately, being together is sometimes the hardest part of life. But life doesn't change unless you make it change. So no matter how scared I am of the future, I changed. The drive was honestly relaxing since it was daytime and I actually felt like I was finally accomplishing something instead of stockpiling anxiety. The traffic on the main highway as I got near Nashville became insane. 20 people driving 130 kilometers per hour, inches away from your car insane. Google told me a crash had happened in the city and redirected me, so I missed that particular anxiety for now. Something I forget about cities is how there's a crash happening basically twice every day in specific spots because everyone drives like a maniac and there's too many people. God, I wish we had Star Trek transporters, somatic existential issues aside. The roads around the airport spiral around in weird ways. Airports are horrible. Google Maps doesn't comprehend these concrete anthills, so its solution was to suggest that I drive into oncoming traffic. To avoid getting onto a highway that I would have been trapped on for another 30 minutes, I had to drive into the luggage pickup lane. So yeah, I had to use traffic signs, like an animal. After I figured out how to get to a parking lot, I bought one of those parking tickets that no one explained how to use. I threw it in my wallet and just hoped I'd be able to pay it in a week. The Nashville airport isn't that big, but I still had to learn what to do. You know, had to take off my belt and shoes and so on. Show my passport like 10 times, ask 5 different employees if I was doing the right thing. None of them cared. While I was finally waiting on the plane, a younger, I think, Indian fellow asked me to help his mother if anything came up because she didn't speak any English. So I ended up trying to figure out how to communicate with her. It did not work. I also installed a version of Google Translate that would later turn out to be a virus. I found that out on the one day that I woke up on my own. That was fun. But I eventually managed to let her know priority boarding had started and they let her on board. I received no thank yous. I had a massive headache by the time I got on the plane. I was also exhausted, hadn't eaten anything in 2 days besides a Wendy's double stack. I really needed to sleep and I was dehydrated. Remember all my sleep problems? I hoped that I would fall asleep on the plane. I did not fall asleep on the plane. I was in agonizing pain on the plane. I spent the whole 9-hour trip trying to get in a comfortable position that wouldn't make my headache worse. Heathrow Airport in London is about 50 times bigger than the Nashville airport. I would best describe it as a human-sized rat maze. It's a lot of empty underground corridors that don't seem to lead anywhere, but to more corridors and elevators. And something I learned about the UK is that they don't seem to believe in signs. Most of the time it's just an unlabeled door to who knows where, with maybe a tiny sign that says something vague like Gloppenschippenwarden, whatever town, Lot B, elevator C5. So I wandered around underground and it literally took me 40 minutes to see a single window. I live in a town of about 2,000 old people, which has an airport for a single crop duster, and that's basically a driveway with a tool shed next to it. So I had no idea the airports were these underground concrete cities. It felt like trying to escape the basement in Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I eventually got to a bus terminal, but I wasn't absolutely sure if it was the right one. I had all these maps printed out to show where things were, but since it's all underground, I just had to use signs. Again, like a caveman. I waited another 5 or 6 hours for my girlfriend to arrive, as I tried to sleep headfirst, sitting down, on my luggage to make sure that it didn't get stolen. It didn't work. I mean, my luggage was fine, but I didn't sleep. I did fall asleep for about 6 minutes once. When my girlfriend arrived, I was exceedingly happy. At this point, I'd been awake for over 30 hours, and I was feeling miserable. On the bus ride, I started thinking about how people can't stay awake for more than a week before they die, and how I'd been going through so much stress that my time frame was way shorter than that. Thankfully, she was there to comfort and help me. Even though I started to feel like I was going to vomit, was near death, and had a massive migraine and was still unable to sleep on this incredibly loud, uncomfortable bus that kept stopping and starting, it's still one of my best memories of being together. I was constantly shaking, had difficulty walking, and kept forgetting where I was, but she managed to get me into a taxi and to our self-check-in hotel. We stayed at a place called Number 100. It's all self-service, but some basic materials for breakfast mysteriously appear in the dining room every morning. I miss my ham and cheese croissant. I like those. I also discovered that UK has a specific brand of oatmeal called Simply Oats that's way, way better than the crap they sell in America. All the food in Cardiff was generally better than what I have eaten in America all my life. But I also live in the middle of nowhere, where all there is to eat is processed Walmart slop. I don't know if it's different somewhere else. Day one was honestly recovery. I felt like I had nearly died. And the first place we ate at was actually Taco Bell, since my lady had never had it and was curious. It was fine, but unimpressive. A little bit different from American Taco Bells. It's not quite as greasy or crunchy. We went to a Polish, I think, little grocery near us that sold Eastern European food and meat and cheeses, so we could make sandwiches. We also had an empty pizza place near us that may have been a crime front, I don't know. The first major thing we actually did was meet up with my girlfriend's best friend. They had never actually met in real life, so both of them were spring-loaded and ready to scream. They latched onto one another like xenomorph facehuggers. We went to this crazy 3-story pub to wait, then headed over to a Korean hot pot. It's a place where they give you specialty broth and food to boil on the table you're sitting at. We had bean sprouts, beef, noodles, stuff like that. I also had alcohol for the first time. Yes, I'm that sheltered and isolated and raised with psychotic religious values. I'd had a little glass of nasty lemonade before, but that's it. Turns out I really like specific ciders. The food was good but overpriced since it's, one of those one-time experience deals. The next day was the big one. We met back up with her best friend and then another friend. The 4 of us went to this afternoon tea place and they served us fancy food. Like a tiny burger, and an egg in a thing. I didn't like the cold shrimp, but I liked the little sub sandwich with pulled pork, I think, in it. I don't know. I bet at explaining what food is. The dessert was some kind of chocolate something or another. I don't know. You can look at the picture. But the little egg thing turned out to be a shell of something with really cold ice cream inside of it. Our other friend found that out by, ingesting the whole thing at once was not the best idea. But then we went over to the Cardiff Center, which is actually a series of giant malls. Here in America, malls are kind of extinct. Probably because to get to a mall, you have to drive to one for anywhere between 15 minutes to an hour. So it was kind of weird to not only see one again, but an enormous, thriving one. It was like walking back into my childhood back in the 1980s. I couldn't bring much of anything back home with me, so I couldn't buy anything anyway. Still cool, but maybe that's part of living in a compressed Welsh city that I don't understand. If you can think of it, someone is probably selling it there. There was a record store, a bunch of flower shops, bakeries, nut shop, an honest-to-God fish shop with actual fish from the ocean. In Kentucky, we have catfish, and that's it. And it's usually about a month old once you get it. Any other fish that you'll actually find in Walmart died about a year ago and will taste like a freezer. So, for a while, it felt like I was actually living in a real place. Like, I was a person who deserved to live on actual food that a person made. Weird. So while walking around, I spotted a Warhammer store. I had this moment of realization that I could actually visit one. An actual UK-based Warhammer shop. They exist in America, technically. There's one within about 200 miles of me, but when I visited that one, it had one sweaty guy working there who was hanging out with his other gross zitty friend, and both made it clear that no one should be there besides them. At the time, I was looking for Necron models before they switched off from using the old metal models. They didn't have a damn thing in there, though. This one, the real UK-based one, had a poster advertising that you could have a free model. I asked about it, and we ended up spending the next 30 minutes painting a guy with a spear. I don't know much about Nun 40k stuff, but it was fun. They give you the model and the free paint, and they just let you sit there and experiment with it. The employee worked with us the whole time, and he was very kind and attentive. Did a really good job. It's a really good experience. I was always bad at analog painting, though. I would never have a hobby of painting units. I'd be full of anxiety the whole time that I wasn't working while I did it. After that, we went to an escape room. This is what I bought my video camera for, only to be told they don't allow it. Since it gives away the game and all. It was Egyptian themed, though. The room was full of sand, and the objective was to open a single door. It also had a comically small skeleton who was one of our grandfathers. Constellations on the ceiling, writing all over the walls that we had to translate into passwords, a giant square grid with a ball-bearing maze inside of it, a box you fill with sand to release a key. It was a whole thing. I guess I won't go into the whole game, but 80-something% of teams failed. I think it's 82 or 84. We cleared it with about 10 minutes left, and would have been faster if we hadn't ended up talking over one another at the very end. By the end, I was writing puzzle solutions in the sand so we'd stop forgetting answers. The important thing is, once it was over, we got some hard drinks and pet their dog. Her name was Watson. I tried to take some pictures of Watson, but she was so excited to get pizza crusts that all three of them turned out to be blurry. We finished off the day eating at a place called Chopsticks Noodle Bar. It had a selection of like 3 types of noodles. Overly expensive, but it was fine. I got some chocolate dip for my girlfriend, but she refused to eat any. Rude. Kind of a weird place. The next day we left Cardiff to head to a quote-unquote small town of less than 10,000 to visit said friends. So, huge by my standards still. One thing I noticed is that I could never tell when we were leaving or entering a town. From Cardiff for the next hour, there were non-stop buildings the whole way. It never looked like we were leaving a town. In America, every town has a very visible ending, where you'll just start seeing a house or two on the side of the road, if any. Then you drive for about 15 or 30 minutes until you reach another town. Until then, it'd be nothing but forest or farmland for the most part. In Wales, when you saw the countryside, it was gorgeous, but if there was ever a valley or flat land, it would be exploding with buildings that were crammed way too tightly together. Because, UK, there's only so much room. Something I found horrific is how all the roads were barely large enough for 2 cars. Since we were on a bus, there were areas where approaching cars had to pull over on the sidewalk just so that we could turn. It felt like we were trying to fit a couch through a door frame. At least 3 times, I looked out the window and saw cars within a finger or 2 from scratching our paint. The driver must have been absurdly experienced. He was an old man, so he probably was, because he knew what he was doing. But we spent the day at our friends. We made potatoes, which I have been instructed to call roasties, and roast. Yorkshire pudding, stuffing, cabbage, parsnips, and foot wine. It's wine with a picture of a foot on it. Then we watched a silly movie called Studio 666, and almost fell asleep several times, because we were exhausted. We pet the farty dog. We were going to play a game about xenomorphs, but we were too exhausted. And that was our trip. The view from the backyard was amazing. It's a beautiful little town, just way better looking than my little crummy town, where everything is completely flat, there are no hills or mountains, and the only stores that you will find will be alcohol stores or housing assistance of some sort. So back home, we had a couple more days to ourselves before we had to worry about getting back home. I'm very used to being sedentary, and she isn't, so we ended up sort of in the middle of activity. She wanted to feel like she was doing more, and I wanted to be a slug. I'm hungry for domestic life, though, so we squeezed in sleep and TV here and there. That Sunday was our castle trip. This whole video you've probably been seeing footage in the background, and that's the one time I was able to record something because it was actually allowed. I was probably the most enamored with the fort because I'd never actually been in an old medieval structure like that. I found the history of it really interesting, and the view from the top was amazing. You can really feel like a scout in the Roman era looking out over the foggy horizon or out towards the ocean. The castle itself was pretty restrictive in where you were allowed to go, but the whole thing was amazing looking. You can really get a feel for what life must have been like for snobby aristocrats while dirty commoners outside were wet and dying from illnesses and poverty. My girlfriend loves Christmas imagery, so it was especially nice that a random guy asked if we wanted our picture taken in front of the big Christmas tree. That's both of our phone backgrounds now. I won't spend too much time on this though, since you can see the footage. My camera does lens the field of vision a bit too much though, so you may have to squint to see the fog rolling off the distant hills of Cardiff's eastern borders. On our trip, we indeed visited a Greggs more than once. It was alright. I had a misconception of what it was, and I thought it was more of a grocery store. It's more like if you took the hot food section from a few gas stations, stitched them into a small store, and, put actually much higher quality food in them. We tried a few of those little baked pies, pasties or something they're called. My girlfriend would become enamored with them and tried her hand at making them at home later on. The potato wedges were about as good as they are in American gas stations or a Walmart. or that was my opinion. She loved them. I thought they were fine. And they're not bad. On Sunday night, we went to a nearby Persian restaurant I was curious about called Moana. No customers besides us. It was nowhere near the city center, so the location probably isn't great. They told us later that most of their customers are actually vacationers like us. Google Maps says it's temporarily closed right now, which is a little worrying because it was a great experience. Maybe because I'm writing this near Christmas, that's probably why. The service was good and the food was amazing. Big portions that I just couldn't finish. We tried a mango drink and something called Doog, which is some kind of salty yogurt-based drink, D-O-O-G-H. It was good, but not something you can chug. The tea was fantastic and supposedly made in the Persian style. I'm not sure what the Persian style was, but they knew what they were doing. Hummus, grape leaf wraps, lamb, corned beef, chicken, soup. All of it was very good. If you're in Cardiff, go there. Support those guys. The next day was Museum Day. Now, I'm not going to bore you with a museum tour. The thing about museums is that they're mildly interesting and more about the experience of going through them. It's sort of like watching this video. It's not so much about the stuff. No one cares what I did. It doesn't matter. It's more about the empathy. It's seeing yourself in other people's experience. You're kind of shotgunning yourself into a room to see if anything there ends up feeling personal to you. Nothing like that really hit me, besides this little footage room where they showed interviews with locals talking about their lives in Cardiff over the century. That hit me because, while some of them worked in, horses or fish or pastries, all of them had a similar life story. They struggled, found people that cared about them, tried to create a work environment they loved, and it ended up changing near the end of their lives. Sometimes for the better, sometimes for worse. It's like the difference between a good or bad history teacher in school. A bad one will just make you memorize dates. When a war ended, when it stopped, crap like that. A good history teacher will talk about why everyone was pissed off or misguided, why a leader grew up to become a monster, why history happened, not that it happened. So I guess I'll throw some of my pictures up here real fast and move on. Then we went to a fancy tea shop and I ate the most oversized sandwich I'd ever had. I had a hard time enjoying it because I was brimming with anxiety at the time. The closer we got to needing to go home, the more I found to worry about. And since I've been building up such a huge amount of anxiety over the months and even years, sometimes I just wake up with it. Museums and tea don't fix that, to be fair. It was a very cute shop though. Honestly, even though we were there such a short time, I feel like that memory best represents the feeling of being on vacation. Anxiety, relaxation on a timer, the feeling of trying to recover from your own plans to recover. My favorite meal of the vacation was the last place we ate out at. A pub that was around the corner from number 100 called the Four Elms. Pretty laid-back place. The Wi-Fi didn't work where we sat, but it was pretty laid-back. We had fish and chips because Britain is really good. It actually reminded me a bit of Long John Silver's in America, but not crappy. We had a loaded potato, which they call jacket potatoes over there. And she had never had onion rings, so we tried those. Although she was so full she ate like half of one. She still liked it though. And I'd never had mushy peas, which is the thing that they serve there, which came with the meal. To me, mashing up peas is heresy, but it was alright. It's sort of like eating mashed potatoes, but peas. It was way too much food, so we couldn't finish it at all. It was also the meal where I discovered Old Malt cider, which may be the best tasting cider in the world. I'd find out later that American cider is ass when I started trying to find a cider to replace it when I got back home. The UK is covered up in ciders though, while America has Angry Orchard, which is like someone poured apple juice into an Amazon worker's pee bottle. After a few weeks, I found Cider Boys, which is mediocre but fine. But anyway, my anxiety was now peaked, and it was time to go home, which meant taking the train to London on 5 hours of sleep, but going to 2 different airports, which also meant that both of us would be completely alone at our halfway point at gigantic airports we'd already gotten lost in, on a time limit, with the threat of being stuck in the UK alone if we didn't make it. The train ride from that stop to the airport was a rough one. I was alone, and I had a lot of thoughts of being trapped, something going wrong with my girlfriend's trip back, or that I'd not used the vacation correctly, or just that I would be a lonely fountain of anxiety that I just couldn't escape forever. It took me a long time to get to my plane. As it turns out, security for leaving the UK is way more aggressive than the security to get into the UK. Seems like it should be the other way around. A whole team showed up to investigate a couple of cans of Romanian pâté my girlfriend had gotten me. They took away my contact solution and my almost used up toothpaste that I had brought into the country. They also rummaged through my luggage so much that it couldn't stand up for the rest of the trip. Nothing good happened the rest of the trip back. The plane liftoff was delayed for 3 hours because one of its toilets was busted. A plane trip to America across the Atlantic also takes longer than the trip out of it, so I was sitting in my plane seat for 13 or 14 hours. The food was at least better than the last time. I'm really glad I brought wired earbuds. None of British Airways USB ports on their chairs worked at all. And of course, there's no cellular reception off-continent, so I had no entertainment options besides watching chair TV. On back of the chair TV, I watched Elemental, Shrek, the first Harry Potter movie, some of The Corpse Bride. I listened to an audiobook before my cell's power got too low. I did everything I could to stave off insanity. It didn't work. I specifically paid for a window seat this time so I could have that experience, since, it'd actually be daytime. We were chasing the setting sun the entire trip, though. Sometimes when the plane turned, it would be pitch black night on one side of the plane, and it looked like midday on the other side. It's very strange. I love looking out of the window, though, like a cat. It's so strange how things on the ground resolve. Stuff that looks huge on the ground ends up looking like video game textures as you go up. You can actually see it change, like your brain starts processing it in a different way. And clouds that look small are actually the size of mountains, because your brain has no frame of reference for it. I looked down over America as, we got closer, and you could see multiple towns that were sometimes hours apart. And I sometimes would think about how long it would take me to fall from this height. Sadly, I didn't see any UFOs or any guys on the wing. That would have been cool. Getting back into the country, because it's Nashville, it was way more lax, thankfully. I mentioned my trouble with my pâté at Heathrow, so the officers in Nashville decided to look through my stuff too. Although at this point, I was so thankful to be back on the ground that I enjoyed hanging out with them, and they were pretty cool about it. They didn't care. I got some bad advice that I could walk back to my car instead of waiting on a transit bus, which had left the very minute that I got there. That resulted in me having to cross 2 highways, walking through one bush, over a bridge, and climbing over a toll barrier arm, all while dragging my luggage on the ground. It ended up taking the same amount of time as waiting on the bus would have taken. I then had to make a few laps to figure out how to leave the parking lot and how to pay my parking ticket, which didn't work the first few tries. And if you remember from the start of my trip, Google Maps doesn't understand the roads around airports, so it again kept directing me in circles and into oncoming traffic. In the process of resetting the app to try to stop it, it switched to walking mode instead of driving, which meant for most of Nashville, the phone was screaming at me to drive directly into oncoming cars or into one-way ramps. The highway out had like 20 lanes, and they like merging into completely new highways you're not meant to be on, with no warning at all. And even though it's pitch black, it was still rush hour, and there were still 100 insane people all aggressively moving into or out of lanes they had no business being in, endangering everyone around them. City traffic is stupid. The open highway across the state back home had one of those pavements that makes noise that sounds like your car is braking. Google Maps again put me on a stupid road that took me into the middle of nowhere, and I had no clue where I was until about 5 minutes from getting home. And of course, by the time I did get home, I've been awake for a full day. That was my journey. It was hell. Would I do it again? Yeah. One thing I decided around, say, turning 40, is that life is your chance to have experiences. You can totally waste it, sitting in a room, playing video games until you realize you're alone and it's too late to stop being alone. You can spend your whole life reassuring yourself that trying is absurdly difficult and it may be hopeless to try. Or you can try. Life will not change unless you make it change. In my experience with people, most fantasize about what life could be, and that's enough for them. Imagining that they're secretly special and no one knows, that if they bothered trying, then everything would change. They're just not going to. The wistful idea that their life might be better if they win the lottery, or they meet someone who will rescue them. Because trying and failing is so damaging to us that most accept that there's comfort in only hoping and living the way that they've always lived. For some, flying is normal. This trip wouldn't bother them at all. For me, it was totally foreign and an incredible, terrifying burden, full of people telling me to just give up and stay in my room. As I get older, I realize most people are obsessed with control in some way. People with power are obvious. My father was hyper-controlling in that way. It's part of why I got screwed up. Other people control their lives by not trying, like me. I nearly died before trying to make this YouTube channel, and that's what saved me. I again nearly died just before my 40th birthday, when I lost friendships, lost a parent, and realized how alone I was, and would be very soon. We're so afraid of being injured or feeling fear that we'll do anything to control our environment to prevent that hurt, even if that means doing nothing. I'm not the best example of someone who tries. I've been beaten down so much over my life that it's extremely painful for me to try. And when I do, it almost always doesn't work out. My life has always been defined by fear, and by others telling me to stay in a corner and not be heard. That I wasn't wanted, or that I wasn't ideal enough. I've always been Mr. Second Place, at best. We're all looking for a life where we feel like we belong. Something we've made ourselves, for us, and for the future of what we most value. I still don't have that, and I may never have that. There are no guarantees in life, because life isn't fair. Some of us are bombarded with love and wealth at birth, then retroactively think they're self-made because they have no context for how bad things can be. Others struggle their whole lives trying hard to be the best version of themselves, but still end up isolated and uncared for, despite having done nothing wrong. Some people got speared through their butts on spikes, or were stolen by a feudal lord on their wedding day. Life is horrible. It's absolutely horrible. People are always the cause and the solution, which is why it's so important that you try, create, and change things to be as better for as many people as you can. Sometimes even if it harms you. A lot of our human life got better because one person invented something important, or because one person wouldn't give up their seat. It doesn't happen often, but it happens because you identify what you want and then try. And even if you don't succeed, there are people who inherit your will, your goals, your research. One door may be harder to open for you than everyone else, but that doesn't make its opening any less special. I may fly again. If I do, it'll be easier. And to me, much more importantly, if I help anyone else fly for the first time, it'll be easier for them too. Until next time, everyone.